Hello everyone. Here we're going to be covering the facial bones of the skull as we have already covered the cranial bones. Here on this slide we have a list of all the facial bones. We'll start with the nasal bone, which is the reddish bone right here in the middle. Then we have the maxilla, which is the yellow bone, the mandible, which is this tan bone down here, the vomer, which is the light red pinkish bone over here. Then we have the inferior nasal conchae, which is the darkest pink on both sides. The zygomatic is the orange bone, which is your cheekbone. The lacrimal bone is the purple bone right here in the middle. And then the palatine bone, we can only see a little bitty part of it, which is a blue bone located right over here. All of these are paired bones except for the vomer and the mandible. These are unpaired bones. And on the next few slides, we will be covering these bones in more details. Let us start with the nasal bones, which are these paired, small, flattened, rectangular bones right over here, and they will form the bridge of the nose. These small bones, they will protect the upper entry of the nasal cavity, and they will also provide attachment for a couple of very thin muscles for facial expression. For those of you who wear glasses, these are the bones that form the resting place for the bridge of the glasses, as we see here on this image. Now, our noses are not this big. The major structural part of the nose is actually consisting of cartilage, which will stick out right over here. Next, we're going to be covering the lacrimal bones, which lacrim means teardrops, and it's this very thin purple bone, as we can see here on this image. It will also contain a fossa, which is called the lacrimal fossa, which will actually house the lacrimal sac, which is a structure that will gather the tears and then pass them into the nasal cavity. So this is why when we cry sometimes and we form tears, they do go from our eyes into the nasal cavity because of the accumulation of tears within the nasal fossa. If you were to pinch your nose on both sides, you would be touching your lacrimal bone. Also, as we can see from this image, it is inside of the orbit, and so it will be one of the bones that will form the medial wall of the orbit. But we will talk about the orbit in more details later on in this learning outcome. The palatine bones are these L-shaped bones that will form the posterior portion of the hard palate. So all of this is the hard palate, and as you can see over here in this line, it's separating the anterior portion, which is made up of the maxilla, and the posterior portion, which is made up of the palatine bone. In addition to forming the roof of the mouth, they will also form the posterior portion of the floor and the walls of the nasal cavity. As we can see from this inferior view, these holes over here are representing the nasal cavity. So you can see how it will be part of the floor of the nasal cavity. In addition, it will be part to a small extent of the formation of the orbit, as we can see right over here from this blue dot over here inside of the orbit. Next, we'll go to the maxilla, and if the word contains an E, it means that it's plural. Therefore, there are two bones. It's a paired bone that will unite to form what we call the upper jaw, and it's represented here in yellow. The maxilla will articulate with every bone of the face except for the mandible, which is the lower jaw. The maxilla will form part of the floors of the orbit, as we can see over here, so the medial portion of the orbit, part of the lateral wall and the floor of the nasal cavity, as we can see over here, and most of the hard palate, as we saw on the previous slide. But just to reiterate, here is the hard palate, and you can see how most of the hard palate is formed by the maxilla, which is the yellow bone represented here. The only bone feature that I need you to know is the infraorbital foramen. Infra means below the orbit, and it's a hole. So this is your infraorbital foramen right over here that's located on the maxilla. We can see it over here as well. And this would be your supraorbital foramen right over there, which is located on the frontal bone. Next, we have the mandible, which is also known as the lower jaw. Mand means to chew, and this is exactly what the mandible will do when it moves. It is the largest and the strongest facial bone that will articulate only with the temporal bone right over here at the mandibular fossa. So this can be a little bit confusing, but you're going to have what we call the mandibular condyle. Remember, condyle is a smooth articulating surface. It can also be called the condylar process. And this process will articulate right over here with the fossa, which is called the mandibular fossa. So don't let this get you confused because even though this bone feature is called the mandibular fossa, is actually present in the temporal bone. Because remember, a bone cannot articulate with itself. So the mandible cannot articulate with the mandible. It will articulate with another bone, in this case, the temporal bone. So the mandibular condyle, or the condylar process of the mandible, will articulate with the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone. The other two bone features that I need you to know are foramina, meaning they're both holes. The first one is the mental foramen, and this hole is located right over here in the anterior part of your mandible. And if you are thinking, like when you put your fingers on your chin and you're thinking, then you're touching your mental foramen. So that's where the word comes from, mentis. The other hole will be located right over here on the posterior part of the mandible, which is called the mandibular foramen. So it's a hole on the mandible, mandibular foramen. The other one is a hole on the part of the mantis. Next, we have the zygomatic bone, which is commonly known as your cheekbones, and they will be the ones that will form these prominences on the cheeks, and they're also going to be part of the lateral wall and floor of each orbit, as we can see over here on this image. They will therefore articulate with the frontal bone right over here, with the maxilla right over here, with the sphenoid over here, and with the temporal bones. With regards to bone feature, there will be a process that will help the zygomatic bone articulate with the temporal bone. And the name of this process is called temporal process. Remember, on the temporal bone, we have a process that will articulate with the zygomatic bone, and this process is called the zygomatic process. So we can summarize that the temporal process of the zygomatic bone will articulate with the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Let's talk now about the nasal septum. The nasal septum is really formed by two bones, and a septum will always divide a compartment. In this case, the nasal septum is going to be dividing the nasal cavity. The bones are the ethmoid bone and the vomer. The vomer is going to be this flat pinkish bone right over here. So this is your vomer. As you can see, it's going to form the inferior portion of the nasal septum. The superior portion is going to be formed by the other bone, which is your ethmoid bone. More specifically, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. Remember that the ethmoid bone has a part that goes up, which is the crista galli, and then it also has the cribriform plate located on the superior view, and then the perpendicular plate is what comes down into the nasal cavity. So if we were to look at this image over here, all of this is your nasal septum. However, the top part of the nasal cavity, which we can divide right over here, would be the ethmoid bone, more specifically the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, and the bottom half would be your vomer, which is a bone. And then the blue part over here is representing the cartilage, which will form the rest of your nose. Notice how above it, right over here, we have the nasal bone. So this is your nasal bone, which we were covering earlier, and therefore the blue part is the cartilage that forms the rest of the nose. On this image, we can see here in this tan color the ethmoid bone with the crista galli sticking up and the perpendicular plate coming down. and this pink bone here in the middle would be your vomer. So all of this forms the nasal septum. Now, because these sheets of bone are very thin, the perpendicular plate and the vomer, it's very common for patients to have this plate deviate either to one side or to the other side. And this is not ideal because it can obstruct one of the passageways if it leans over to one side. So this is what we call a deviated nasal septum. Now, there is surgery that you can do to make it straight again, but it's not always successful. And in addition, it is very painful. We did talk about the vomer on the previous slide, but just so you see how it's made of this very thin sheet and it's a bone on its own. It is unpaired and it will have this triangular shape. And again, it will form the inferior portion of the nasal septum. The way I remember that the vomer is the inferior portion of the nasal septum is that the vomer starts with a V, so it's like an arrow pointing down. So therefore, the vomer will be on the bottom of the nasal septum. As we can see, the vomer will articulate with the ethmoid to form the nasal septum. It will also articulate posteriorly with the sphenoid, and inferiorly it will articulate with the hard palate, which is the palatine bone and the maxilla. Here we have the inferior nasal conchae, which is a paired bone. You're going to have one on each side. We can see on the left side over here, and we can see a little bit on the right side, together with the other two nasal conchae, which are the superior and the middle nasal conchae, as we can see on this image. So these two are the superior, the middle, and down here would be your inferior nasal conchae. They are going to help to swirl and filter the air that you inspire that will then go into the lungs. Now remember that the superior nasal conchae and the middle nasal conchae, these two are going to be part of the ethmoid bone. However, the inferior nasal conchae is a separate bone. It is not part of the ethmoid bone. Now, throughout the lecture, we have been talking a lot about the bones that form the orbit, but here we're going to focus solely on this concept. There are 7 bones that form the orbit. 3 of them are cranial bones and 4 of them are facial bones. The 3 cranial bones are the frontal bone, the sphenoid, and the ethmoid bone. And the 4 facial bones are the lacrimal, the maxilla, the palatine, and the zygomatic bone. As we can see from this image, the frontal bone, which is the blue colored bone over here, will form the superior part of the orbit. The lacrimal, the sphenoid, a little bit of the palatine, and a little bit of the maxilla will form the medial wall of the orbit. Next, we can see how the maxilla will also form the inferior medial portion of the orbit, and the inferior and lateral portion of the eye will be formed by the zygomatic bone. Also associated with the orbit are 5 openings. The first one would be your optic canal right over there. The second one is the superior orbital fissure. Then this would be your inferior orbital fissure. You're going to have the little hole on top of the orbit, which is the supraorbital foramen. And lastly, there's an opening on the lacrimal bone, which is the lacrimal fossa, that allows the tears to go from the orbit inside of the nasal cavity.